How does a nation, well, how does it successfully balance its oldest strategic ties with its newest geopolitical friendships, especially in a world that's shifting so rapidly?
Yeah.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're really digging into what our sources call the special and privileged strategic partnership between India and Russia. And look, this isn't some simple, straightforward alliance. It's complex, multi-layered. It's got these deep historical roots, but it's also uniquely adapted. Always seems to defy easy labels.
Yeah, and for this deep dive, the sources we've looked at are, well, they're incredibly comprehensive. They cover everything from the historical diplomacy that really forged this bond, right through to the cutting-edge defense and energy strategies that are shaping its future now. Our goal here is to help you understand not just the what of this connection, but really the why. Why is it so enduring?
That's exactly it. Our mission is to unpack these intricate dynamics. We want to reveal the surprising facts, the crucial insights that make this India-Russia partnership so resilient, even when global pressures are intense. Get ready for some real aha moments, because this is where it gets really interesting. Okay, so let's unpack this history a bit. Our sources keep saying this relationship is time-tested, roots way back in the Soviet era. How did this deep trust actually start?
Well, it's quite striking how closely India and the Soviet Union aligned during the Cold War. I mean, India had its non-alignment policy officially, but the USSR really emerged as this incredibly consistent, reliable partner, especially when, many Western powers were pretty suspicious of India's stance back then. And it wasn't just talk, not just diplomacy. The Soviets were absolutely instrumental in building India's industrial backbone. We're talking like huge steel plants, Bhilai, Bokaro, foundational stuff built with a lot of Soviet help.
So real tangible support, not just political nods. And the defense ties, you mentioned those earlier. How critical were they? Were they like a lifeline?
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Without a doubt. The USSR was India's main arms supplier. And it wasn't just selling hardware, it was crucial technology transfer, too. That was key, because it let India start building its own defense industry, moving beyond just being a customer. And a really pivotal moment here was the 1971 Treaty of Peace, Friendship, and Cooperation. That was a landmark. It really solidified their strategic alignment, especially during that intense period.
The Bangladesh Liberation War.
Exactly. That treaty was huge then.
Okay, so that sounds like a game changer. But then, fast forward to 91, the Soviet Union collapses. You'd think that might just sever the whole thing, right?
You might think so, but no, not at all, actually. I mean, sure, there was initial chaos, massive turmoil in Russia, but both countries, remarkably quickly, reaffirmed their ties. It was quite pragmatic, and that pragmatism directly led to the Declaration on Strategic Partnership in 2000. That was during President Putin's visit to India. It formally recommitted them both to a long-term, comprehensive partnership, one that went way beyond just defense. If you look at the bigger picture, it just showed how much strategic value both sides still saw in keeping that bond alive, even in this totally different world.
So it really did evolve. And now our sources call it this special and privileged strategic partnership.
Yeah.
What are the main pillars holding it up today?
Okay, well, unquestionably, the biggest pillar is still defense and military technical cooperation. Russia is still India's largest defense supplier. We're talking, around 36% of India's total arms imports between 2019 and 2023, so still very significant.
And it's serious stuff, right? Not just basic equipment, like the S-400 air defense systems. India pushed ahead with that despite a lot of Western pressure today.
Precisely. The S-400 Triumph, that's a critical piece of kit for India's air defense. And yes, India moved forward even with those U.S. CAATSA threats hanging over them. The Countering America's Adversaries Through Sanctions Act, that was meant to penalize deals like this. But Russian officials confirmed just this June, June 2025, that the remaining systems are on track. Delivery by 2025, 2026, it really highlights the resilience of that defense link. It's strategically vital for India. And beyond just buying things, we see these really successful joint ventures, like the BrahMos missile, that supersonic cruise missile, highly successful. India uses it. They're even exporting it now. Plus, there's license production, building things like the S-30 MKI jets, the T-90 tanks in India.
Right, so you mentioned India moving beyond just being a buyer, becoming a co-developer. What does that actually mean for India strategically?
Yeah, well, it's a huge leap. It means moving towards genuine strategic autonomy. It helps build up their own domestic innovation, creates high-tech jobs, and crucially, it reduces that long-term dependence on outside suppliers. It could even open doors for India to export more itself down the line. It's a big deal.
Definitely sounds like a critical shift. Okay, shifting gears a bit, our sources highlight another area that's growing fast, especially recently: energy cooperation. What's the story there? What's driving that growth?
Yeah, this is where you really see India's pragmatic foreign policy in action. Russia has, well, it's surged to become India's #1 supplier of crude oil, particularly since the conflict in Ukraine started. India significantly ramped up imports of discounted Russian crude. It hit nearly 2 million barrels per day back in April 2025. That was a 2-year high. And India's refineries are processing this crude, and interestingly, they're even re-exporting some refined products to Europe. It shows a very commercially savvy approach.
Huh. And it's not just oil, though, is it? What about
Uh-huh.
nuclear energy? That seems like a much longer-standing thing between them.
Absolutely. Nuclear energy is definitely a flagship area. Russia's been a key partner in India's civilian nuclear program for a long time. Kudankulam nuclear power plant down in Tamil Nadu is the prime example. But what's really significant lately is the move into more advanced tech. Maharashtra signed an MU, this was late 2024 or early 2025, to develop India's first thorium-based small modular reactor, an SMR. And that's with Russian collaboration. It signals a potential shift, beyond just conventional nuclear power. Using India's big thorium reserves could be massive for long-term energy security. And it potentially puts both countries at the forefront of next-gen nuclear tech.
Okay, so beyond those really critical areas, defense and energy, what about just economic and trade relations? Sources say it's growing, but there are challenges too.
Yeah, bilateral trade has definitely surged. It hit, $65, $66 billion in 2023-24. That makes Russia India's second largest trading partner now. And there's this ambitious goal to reach $100 billion before 2030. But there's a big trade imbalance, a really substantial one. It's mainly because India imports so much oil and fertilizer from Russia. Both countries are pushing for trade in their own currencies, the rupee-ruble mechanism trying to bypass Western sanctions. But there are still hurdles, like currency convertibility issues, and just the sheer size of that imbalance. That's something they need to work on.
Right, that imbalance sounds tricky. And connectivity seems like another big strategic theme. Things like the International North-South Transport Corridor, the INSTC. How important is that?
Oh, the INSTC is crucial. It's this multimodal trade route, ships, rail, road designed to connect India through Iran up to Russia, Central Asia, and potentially Europe. The big deal is it cuts down transit time and costs significantly compared to the old Suez Canal routes. It could really reshape regional trade flows. And then there's also the proposed Chennai-Vladivostok maritime corridor linking India's east coast with Russia's far east. Plus, India is showing more interest in the Arctic, looking to leverage Russian know-how for the Northern Sea route. These aren't just about trade routes, they're about fundamentally rethinking geopolitical supply chains.
And we're still seeing ongoing science, technology, and space cooperation too, right? What are the key things happening there now?
Definitely. Their space collaboration goes way back. Think India's first satellite, Aryabhata, launched by the Soviets. Today, that partnership is very visible, with Russia helping India on its Gaganyaan mission, the human spaceflight program. That includes training Indian astronauts, which is critical.
Yeah.
They're also exploring cooperation on satellite navigation systems, like Russia's GLONASS and India's own NAVIC. So joint efforts in pretty important dual-use tech areas.
What about the people side of things, people-to-people ties? Does that still play a big role in keeping the relationship grounded, or has it faded?
It absolutely still plays a role, and maybe in some surprising new ways. Traditionally, you've had thousands of Indian students in Russia, maybe over 30,000, especially studying medicine, engineering. But what's really jumped out in the recent sources is this significant surge in Indian labor migration to Russia. Over 36,000 work permits issued in 2024 alone, and they're projecting it could top 40,000 in 2025. Now, this seems driven partly by Russia needing workers, but it could actually be rekindling those grassroots connections. Maybe fostering deeper cultural understanding again. It's an interesting development.
Huh. Yeah, that is interesting. Okay, and finally, how do they work together on the global stage? Their multilateral cooperation.
Well, they're both key players in groups like BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, the SKO. And within those forums, they consistently push for a multipolar world order. That's a vision that, challenges the traditional Western-led setup. Russia has also been a really steadfast supporter of India getting a permanent seat on a reformed UN Security Council. So coordinating on these big global issues, it's not just lip service. It's a core part of their diplomatic alignment and their shared vision for how the world should work.
Okay, so putting all this together, what does it mean for the future? Because despite these deep, deep ties, our sources definitely point to some pretty significant challenges now. Hurdles testing the relationship. What are they?
Yeah, and this really throws India's strategic balancing act into sharp relief. I mean, India's getting closer to the U.S., to the Quad countries,
Mhm.
and Russia is certainly watching that cautiously. It adds complexity. But then, conversely, you have Russia getting much deeper into alignment with China, especially since the Ukraine conflict kicked off. And that's a major concern for India, given its own strategic competition, its border issues with China. These are like competing gravitational pulls, creating real tension.
You mentioned Ukraine again. Those widespread Western sanctions on Russia. How have they actually impacted India? Has it made it hard to keep this partnership going smoothly?
Well, they've definitely created problems, especially for things like traditional banking channels. And there have been some reports of delays in defense deliveries. But overall, India seems to have navigated it pretty adeptly. They've used those local currency mechanisms for trade, like we talked about, and they've really stuck to their independent foreign policy stance. India stayed neutral on the Ukraine conflict itself, called for dialogue for peace, while at the same time, pragmatically, they increased imports of that discounted Russian crude oil, which actually probably helped ease some inflation pressure back home in India.
Right. So beyond the geopolitics and sanctions, any other big challenges the sources flag? Things that might test the relationship long term?
Absolutely. That trade imbalance you mentioned, India importing way more from Russia than it exports, that's a persistent issue. They need to find ways to make the economic side more balanced for it to be truly sustainable long term. And there are now some emerging questions, some concerns about Russia's long-term technological edge and its industrial capacity, too, especially with sanctions biting and so much focus on the war effort. India is definitely watching how that might affect future defense supplies and tech collaboration.
Okay, so given all those complexities, let's just quickly touch on some of the very latest developments, say, since 2024, things that show how this relationship is still moving, still adapting. What stands out?
Well, one key thing was that confirmation in June 2025 that the rest of the S-400s are still coming, expected by 2025, 2026. So sticking to that major agreement. Also, India really cementing its role as Russia's top strategic energy partner. We saw that with crude imports hitting that two-year high in May 2025. And that MOU for the thorium-based SMR in Maharashtra, the small nuclear reactor with Russian help, that's a pretty exciting forward-looking development from late 24, early 25.
And that labor migration trend you mentioned. That counts as a recent development, too.
Yeah, I'd say so. The sheer scale of the increase projected over 40,000 Indian workers in Russia in 2025. That's definitely a new and notable dimension in their ties. Shows a pragmatic response to needs on both sides.
Yeah.
Oh, and one other point, maybe more of an observation. The annual India-Russia summit, which was a really long-standing tradition, it didn't actually happen in 2024. Now, high-level meetings are still happening in other ways, but the absence of that specific summit, well, it could be due to lots of things. Ukraine, India's elections maybe, but it's something to keep an eye on.
You know, what really stands out for me from this whole deep dive is just how this relationship forged way back in the Cold War. It hasn't just survived, it's still a cornerstone of India's foreign policy today. It feels very pragmatic, defined by, yes, mutual trust and shared history, but also a clear convergence of interests, especially around wanting a multipolar world.
Absolutely. And if you zoom out, you really see this partnership as a prime example of India's broader multi-alignment strategy. It lets India leverage those deep ties with Moscow for really critical needs defense, energy, while at the same time expanding engagement with the West, with the U.S. It's really a testament to India's commitment to strategic autonomy and navigating a very complex world on its own terms.
So for you, our listener, what does this deep dive really tell us about how global diplomacy actually works? How do nations manage that balancing act between old loyalties and new realities? This India-Russia relationship, it really makes you wonder, doesn't it? Can a partnership truly be special and privileged in today's world, which feels increasingly fragmented? Or is its endurance just, well, a strategic necessity that keeps finding ways to adapt? Definitely something to mull over as we all think about the future of international relations.